You are about to hear a story that begins on a small Alaskan street under a sky the color of iron and ends with questions that still echo through a town that trusted its protectors. A story that starts with a 19-year-old basketball player who vanished one night and ends with a police officer in a courtroom, a conviction, and a community forced to reckon with betrayal, with silence, with fear. If you love deep, slow true crime storytelling that pulls at the edges of trust and justice, hit subscribe now so you don't miss the full breakdown of what happened to Sonya Ivanoff and how one small town changed forever. The sound of a single basketball clapping the pavement, sneakers scuffing, laughter carried off into the dark. These are ordinary sounds in a small town like Nome, Alaska, but the ordinary can break on a single night and never quite be mended again. Sonya Ivanoff was 19, a promising young athlete from a tight-knit community, smart, bright, someone people expected to grow up and leave and come back with stories. On the night of August 10th and into the early morning of August 11th, she was out with friends, and then she disappeared, later to be found lying in a clump of scrub off an abandoned road outside of town, stripped of clothing and shot at point-blank range. The news that her disappearance would become a headline sent a chill through Nome, and when an officer of that same department was eventually accused and convicted of her murder, the shock was doubled by betrayal. She laughed easily, she played hard, she was one of those kids who made adults in a small town swell up with pride because she was polite and fierce in equal measure. Friends described her as warm, athletic, someone who moved through the world with plans and a future. She'd moved to Nome a couple of years before and had become known for her athleticism on the court and her presence off it. Freshmen and seniors knew Sonya's smile. She had plans, maybe college basketball, maybe more. The abruptness of her loss made every small ambition now a hollow ache for everyone who loved her. It was late summer, the air still, and the kind of darkness in Alaska that feels absolute. Sonya had been out with friends on the night of August 10th. Laughter, music, maybe a midnight run for coffee or snacks. Details of the evening are the kind that multiply with retelling. Last seen leaving a gathering, supposed to be home, then gone. Her roommate wakes the next morning, and the absence is immediate and wrong. In small towns, you notice absences first before the alarms get pulled. Worry spreads like a shadow, and friends and family begin to search neighborhoods, call phones, knock on doors, and as hours pass, the worry sharpens into fear. A missing person case opens, and the town leans in. The next evening, August 12th, a passerby or a pair of searchers found her body off a seldom-used dirt road beyond town, tucked in the scrub and willow, removed of clothing, shot once in the head at close range. Quiet evidence of a violence that was singular and brutal. The discovery was the end of the frantic searching and the start of something far nastier. Death brings facts in its wake, but it also brings unbearable questions. Who, why, how, and perhaps worse for a community, who among us could have done this? At first, investigators combed the scene for the expected clues: tire tracks, DNA, witness accounts, cell phone pings if there were any to be had in that early 2000s frontier tech environment. But it was witness information that would change everything. Someone who had seen or heard something that didn't fit the original timelines came forward, and their tip pointed in a direction that stunned the town. A Nome police officer, a man sworn to protect, had been seen with Sonya the night she disappeared. It is one thing when a stranger is accused of a violent crime. It is something else when the accused is wearing the badge, the uniform that makes people feel safe, and the notion that a protector could be a predator forced a reckoning in Nome that was both immediate and raw. The man who would be charged was Matthew Clay Owens, a Nome police officer. In his late 20s at the time, Owens would become the center of a legal and moral storm that drew attention outside Alaska and into national headlines when the case raised questions about how rural departments investigate themselves and how reports of abuse and predation are treated in isolated towns. The allegations were stark. The testimony and evidence that emerged pointed to an officer who had picked up Sonya in his police vehicle in the early hours and who later, according to prosecutors and witnesses, had been involved in her death. The details at trial would show a chain of custody of evidence and witness statements that juries would have to weigh against the presumption of honor we tend to grant the badge. Imagine Nome then, a population where faces are familiar, where reputations carry and gossip moves like a river under frozen ground. The idea that an officer might have been capable of this violence was catastrophic. Families who had trusted those who patrolled the streets began to question phone calls, car rides, jokes exchanged at the gas station. And for Sonya's family, the loss was a private cataclysm turned public as emotions were intruded upon by news vans and reporters and the slow, draining mechanics of law enforcement. There were mutterings and outrage and heartbreak, but also a pervasive worry. Would justice be delivered where suspicion pointed at a member of the town's only police force? The investigators laid out their timeline carefully, step by step. Sonya leaves a friend's house late on the 10th or early morning of the 11th. She doesn't make it home. Neighbors report nothing at first. Later, a witness account places her in a vehicle with Owens. That was the core pivot of the prosecution's narrative, that a sworn officer had contact with Sonya on the night she vanished, and that her body was found soon after. Stripped and executed, the physical evidence included bullet wounds, consistent with a very close shot to the head, and some items of clothing and DNA evidence that prosecutors argued tied the officer to the crime. Defense counsel tried to chip away at the credibility of witnesses and push alternative timelines, but the weight of witness statements, physical forensics, and later corroboration was heavy enough to push the case forward to trial. If you're following this series and you want every update and our deep dives into cases where trust was betrayed and justice fought for, pause and hit subscribe now, because we'll be unpacking the trial, the appeals, and the law named for Sonya that tried to make sure this could never be repeated. The first trial ended in a hung jury. Juries can be unpredictable, and when the accused is a badge-wearing officer, the jurors wrestle with trust and reasonable doubt in different ways. But the prosecution did not relent. The case was retried in a different venue to try to ensure an impartial jury. Authorities moved the second trial to Kotzebue, where the jury would consider the prosecution's narrative with fresh eyes. In the second trial, the prosecution presented witnesses who recounted seeing Sonya in Owen's presence, forensic evidence about the manner of her death, and a pattern of behavior that the state argued was consistent with the alleged crime. On December 6, 2005, according to reporting in court records, Matthew Owens was found guilty of first-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence. The judge later sentenced Owens to 101 years in prison, a sentence that underlined the severity of the verdict and the community's demand for a punishment commensurate with the gravity of the crime. A jury deciding the fate of a cop accused of killing a young woman in a small town carries weight beyond the courtroom. The deliberations were surely long and fraught with the faces of Sonya's family and the image of a life extinguished. Guilt in a court must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and for a second jury the evidence met that burden. After the guilty verdict, the town had to make sense of it. Some felt vindicated that the system worked and that an offender was behind bars. Others felt the fracture of betrayed trust deep in their bones. For Sonya's family, a conviction could not restore the person they lost, but it was a public recognition of a truth they'd been living in private pain for years. Convictions are rarely the final chapter in high-profile cases. Appeals followed. Challenges to procedure and legal representation were raised. Owens appealed his conviction and later sought post-conviction relief, claiming ineffective assistance of counsel among other issues. Appeals courts reviewed the record and at various stages upheld the conviction. The Alaska Court of Appeals affirmed aspects of the case, and the murder conviction stood through appellate scrutiny. The legal process kept the case in headlines and legal opinions for years as Owens sought relief, and the family tried to hold onto a fragile peace. Beyond statutory appeals, there was a social and administrative accounting. Internal audits of the local police department and of how sexual assaults and reports involving officers were handled came into sharper focus. Nome's police department had to confront allegations that it had failed to fully investigate sexual assault complaints, and that a culture of silence or protection might have allowed predatory conduct to continue. Reporters and watchdogs documented a pattern of neglect in how rural departments handle sensitive complaints. The Sonya Ivanoff case became both a tragedy and a lesson. How do you police the police in a town where everyone knows everyone? And what institutional safeguards have to exist to prevent abuse of power? Outrage and tragedy sometimes push lawmakers to act. In the wake of the case, Alaska passed legislation aimed at holding law enforcement to account when an officer commits murder in the line of duty. Colloquially referenced in news reports as the Sonya Ivanoff Law, it established mandatory maximum sentences for officers convicted of murder while on duty. The law is one tangible outcome of Sonya's case, a legal attempt to ensure that the badge cannot insulate a person from the full weight of criminal responsibility. Policy changes like this are messy and imperfect, but they signal a community wrestling with how to prevent repeat harms. Legal wins and statutes don't fill the empty chair at a family table. For Sonya's parents, siblings, friends, the daily reality was grief and the long wake of memories they were not allowed to forget. They attended hearings, sat through testimony, and had to present themselves before a public and a press. Survivors of violent crimes often report a secondary trauma from the systems meant to deliver justice. The replaying of autopsy photos, the exposure to gory testimony, the intimate degradation of cross-examination. Sonya's family endured that public pain while also trying to keep private memories intact. Every birthday and holiday became a quiet battle against a grief that shifts shape but never leaves. The forensics in Sonya's case were not a single forensic thread, but several. Ballistics and wound analysis, which indicated a shot to the head at very close range, DNA and physical evidence collected and analyzed, and witness accounts that tried to place a timeline on the officer's interaction with Sonya that night. Defense teams often attack forensic links and witness reliability, particularly in rural settings where memories can blur and circumstances complicate timelines, yet prosecution. Teams in this case managed to present an integrated narrative that convinced a second jury beyond reasonable doubt that Matthew Owens was the killer. The jury verdict rested on a combination of physical evidence and corroborating testimonies rather than a lone fingerprint or a single eyewitness. If this deep dive into evidence and the law is your kind of content, and you want more episodes like this with scene directions, forensic breakdowns, and courtroom pacing, subscribe now and ring that bell. We release deep narrative videos that give every case the time it deserves. Court records are a ledger of the struggle between defense and prosecution. The Alaska Court of Appeals reviewed Owens' case multiple times. They scrutinized assertions and procedural claims, and ultimately, in many instances, rejected attempts to overturn the conviction. Appellate opinions often hinge on technical legal standards. Whether evidence was admitted properly, whether jurors were fairly instructed, and whether counsel performed at the level the Constitution demands. In Owens' appeals, the courts found that the convictions were supported by the evidence presented, and thus the sentence remained in force. It's tempting for people to try to make sense of senseless acts by slotting them into a narrative: a jealous stranger, a drug deal gone wrong, a domestic dispute. But when someone trusted with public safety commits violence, the explanation that people reach for is darker. Abuse of power, predation masked as authority, opportunity combined with access, and terrifyingly, the ability to shape initial narratives by controlling early investigations, whether that happened in this case in every sense is something juries and courts and watchdogs had to parse, and parsing takes time and evidence, not rumor. Matthew Owens was sentenced to 101 years after his conviction, and despite various appeals and petitions for post-conviction relief, his sentence has been repeatedly upheld by courts that reviewed his claims. The legal system locked him away for decades. But the real question for Nome can't be answered by prison alone. How do you restore trust in constabulary institutions in a small place? How do you ensure the safety of vulnerable people and hold offenders within law enforcement to the same standard as everyone else? Legislation and oversight were partial answers, but the community conversation continues. If you sit with Sonya's photograph for a long time, you don't only see a victim. You see a life in progress, a horizon closed off too early. People who loved her left with a hole that no conviction can seal. The law gave them a measure of accountability, and the town a narrative of wrongdoing acknowledged. But the scars remain. The point of telling these stories is not to savor tragedy, but to insist upon memory, to press institutions to do better. If Sonya's story moved you, if you want to make sure these voices are remembered, and these cases kept in public view, so they lead to reform and not just outrage, hit subscribe and join our community. Share this episode with someone who values justice and accountability, and leave a comment below about what details struck you the most. Every share helps keep Sonya's memory alive. Thank you for listening, and for refusing to let this story fade into the tundra. We'll be back with another deep dive into a case that will make you question who we trust and why. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.